Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Horror Corner. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Urshan, and this week we are doing a tag video. This is the top 10 deaths in horror. That's right, guys, the whole history of horror films. And this tag was created by Horror Enthusiast 101, which is a Facebook page made up of a bunch of us horror YouTubers. So if you guys get a chance, definitely check out that page. And I found out about this by watching Need Gore's video, so check his video out as well. And I just thought this would be so fun to try. I thought this would be a blast. So let's get into it, shall we? I'm going to start off with some honorable mentions, ones that just barely missed the cut. And the first one is going to be from Maniac, the classic slasher film from 1980 starring Joe Spinell in the role of Frank Zito. And the death scene I'm talking about is the death of Tom Savini's character. That's right, Tom Savini, the master of special makeup and effects, has a cameo in the film, and he actually gets killed. And he has the nastiest death scene in the whole movie, and that's when Frank Zito runs up on his car and blasts him with a shotgun right through the windshield, and it goes right in his head and blows his head to pieces. You know, it's splattered everywhere like a watermelon. It's so nasty. Next up is going to be from the legendary Omen. Such a great horror classic, and it has one of my favorite death scenes. And that's when the guy gets killed from a plate glass window, which this truck like backs up, and it's got a whole bunch of plate glass windows on it, and the truck backs up, stops short, and one of them comes sliding out and completely decapitates this guy, and you see his head roll up in the air and and fall right on top of his body, and then you see the look of horror on the face of Gregory Peck's character. So classic. Next up is from Hostel 2, which was on Need Gore's top 10 list. So it just barely misses the cut for me here. And it is the same scene that he's talking about, and that was the bloodbath kill. Which I believe was kind of inspired by the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Real-life serial killer. And you see the woman hanging up upside down in the air naked, and this other woman comes in with a robe, and she takes off her robe, and she's completely naked, and she has a sickle, and she uses the sickle and cuts her throat, and you see the blood just pour and spill all over her naked body, and she's rubbing it all over herself. It's pretty messed up. It's really sadistic and brutal. Yeah, Hostel 2 definitely raised the stakes of the gore and the blood. Next up is going to be from Sleepaway Camp to Unhappy Campers. Yes, one of the most fun slasher movies of all time. And the kill I'm talking about is the infamous outhouse kill. The character, Allie, who is like the bitch of the movie, the one you want to see get the worst. And of course she does. She has the most elaborate death scene in the film. Angela takes her into the outhouse and just completely dunks her whole body into the outhouse. And it's so gross. You can hear the water splashing around with the piss and shit, and then you see her head pop up, and you see all the shit on her face, and leeches on her face, and piss. Oh, it's disgusting. So for that reason, it makes the honorable mention list. Alright guys, let's get into the top 10. And in that number 10 is going to be from this classic right here, Dario Argento's Deep Red, the classic Italian giallo film. And it's going to be the death of this woman right here from the opera scene. Oh man, it's such a unrelenting and vicious kill, and that is the hatchet murder. And it's also very emotional because you keep seeing the woman try to crawl away, get away for her life, you know. And each time, the harder she tries, She keeps getting the hatchet buried right into her, buried into her shoulder, buried into her chest. It's nasty. And it gets emotional. She almost gets to the window, and when she does get to the window, the glass just shatters, and she gets the glass shard in her neck, and oh, it's so brutal. So it's so prolonged and vicious and mean-spirited, and that's why it makes the list. Next up is going to be from the classic Hellraiser from Clive Barker, the master. And it's such an iconic death scene, and of course I'm talking about the death of Frank, Uncle Frank. And when the Cenobites finally catch up with him at the end and get their revenge, they send the meat hooks on him, and they sink right into his face and pull his face apart, and just before he dies, he says, "Jesus wept." Whoosh, and you see his face completely ripped to pieces. Oh man, it's rough. Next up, it's going to be from this classic slasher film, The Burning. Also featuring phenomenal special makeup and effects from the legendary Tom Savini. And of course you know the scene that I'm talking about, and that is the raft scene kill. When you see the killer Cropsey rise up from the raft with his garden shears in hand, and he clips off like 3 of this dude's fingers, and he plunges the shears right into this dude's neck all the way in. And then the next you see him slash this girl's forehead right across the face. Oh man, it is brutal, it is rough. So awesome gore and makeup effects by Tom Savini in that scene. And next up is one you don't usually hear too much about, but it is a really rough slasher film, and that is The New York Ripper, of course, made by Lucio Fulci, the Italian gore master. And there's a lot of brutal and vicious kills in this film, but the one I'm talking about is the kill with the prostitute, and the killer takes a straight razor in his hand and just buries it right into the girl's chest and slides it all the way down through her stomach, and it's real deep in there. And then he takes it and slashes it across the girl's breast and goes right through her nipple. It's so nasty. And if that's not bad enough, then he takes the razor into the girl's forehead, all the way down her face to her eyeball, right through her eyeball, and down the rest of her face. Oh man, it's just unrelenting and brutal. So vicious. Okay guys, next up is going to be such an iconic kill from such an iconic movie, and that is Friday the 13th Part 2, the first horror film that I ever saw. And it's going to be, of course, the guy in the wheelchair who looks around. It's a very suspenseful scene. He looks around because he hears noises. It's late at night. It's pitch black out at Camp Crystal Lake. And bam, he gets the machete right to the face out of nowhere. And not only does he get the machete to the face, he rolls down this huge flight of stairs. Oh man, it's so cruel and so mean-spirited and just nasty. So Friday the 13th Part 2. Next up is going to be for the legendary masterpiece from Wes Craven, the original Nightmare on Elm Street. And of course I'm talking about Tina's death in the film as played by Amanda Wyss. Such a classic scene. It's such a classic dream sequence leading up to the murder, but it pays off so big with the brutal murder of Tina. When you see her going up the ceiling, you know, and you see Freddy is actually invisible. You see Rod yelling up, "Where are you?" You know, and the cuts just are happening. You see Freddy's glove just ripping right into her, and you see the blood pouring from her body, and she's like trapped on top of the ceiling, and then you see her just fall down to her death, and the blood splatter everywhere, you know. It's nasty. Such an awesome dream sequence that ends with such an awesome death scene. And next up, you knew that this had to be on there, and that is, of course, the shower scene from the original Psycho from 1960, as directed by the brilliant Alfred Hitchcock. Now, it's such an epic scene. It's the most famous death scene in the history of cinema. You know, not just horror. And it's not just famous because of the brutality of the kill, from the blood of the kill, because you barely see a drop of blood. You see a little bit of blood go down the drain at the end there. That's it. That's the only blood you see. But you just feel the violence. You feel the brutality of it. Because of the way it's shot, the tricky camera angles, just the brilliant way that it's directed by Alfred Hitchcock, the great editing, and just the amazing style of it, you know. And when, at the end, you see the close-up of eyeball, and you see the pupils slowly dilate, and it's also amazing because of the performance of Janet Leigh. She just sells it. The way she's so dramatic, the way she grips and grabs onto the shower curtain and falls down. Just a brilliant performance. It's just an awesome, awesome scene. And you just gotta put it on the top 10. Next up is going to be another amazing death scene, and that is from Day of the Dead. Yes, from George A. Romero, the zombie horror masterpiece. And it's, to me, probably the most satisfying death scene in horror history. And that's because of this douchebag Captain Rhodes, who's like the biggest a-hole in the history of horror films. And you just can't wait for him to die. You can't wait for some way for someone to kill him. And that's exactly what happens, and of course he gets the most elaborate death scene ever. And that's when Bub catches up with him. Bub, that's the smart zombie guy. And Bub finds a handgun and starts shooting at him. And he clips him a couple times in the leg and the chest, you know. And as Captain Rhodes is slowly like crawling away, he does finally make it to a door. But as soon as the door opens, it's filled with a horde of zombies. So it's like, where do I go? Do I go towards Bud and have him shoot me more? Or do I go towards the zombies where they're going to rip me to pieces? So Bub does not give him a choice. So Bub blasts him one more time and he gives the old salute. I love it. And as soon as he gets shot one more time, he falls into the hands of the horde of zombies, and the zombies just rip him to shreds, you know. They rip his whole intestines out, they rip the legs off from his body. It's so brutal, and as he's slowly dying, he's like, choke on him! It's awesome. So awesome. Alright guys, we're getting into the nitty gritty here, the top 2. What's it gonna be? And of course the next one is going to be from Halloween 2, baby, 1981. The classic. My favorite horror sequel of all time. And one of my absolute favorite death scenes, and I'm talking about the hot tub kill of Nurse Karen. Yes. It's just the way it's shot. It's shot so brilliantly, and I give all the credit in the world to Rick Rosenthal. He did such a great job on this scene. And it's just so morbid, it's so realistic, and it's so brutal. Not just because there's so much blood and gore, but it just feels so realistic. And, of course, the events leading up to it, where you see Michael just messing with Nurse Karen, and, you know, puts his hand on her shoulder, and she thinks it's her boyfriend, and she's like kissing his hand and stuff, and as soon as she turns around, she's horrified, and Michael Myers dunks her head in the scalding hot water. As we saw earlier, he turned the knob way up, way beyond human capacity, and each time you see her head come up, her face is burning more, and after a while you see the flesh ripping, flesh just hanging from her face. It's so nasty. And eventually she falls to her death, and you see the close-up of her face just burnt to a crisp, you know. It's nasty, and it's awesome. I love it. Alright guys, what's it gonna be? Number 1. What's the number 1 death scene in horror history. For me, it's going to be from this masterpiece, this zombie horror classic, and that is Zombie from Lucio Fulci, or Zombie 2, or Zombie Flesh Eaters, or whatever name you want to call it. But it's such an iconic scene. To me, it's just the most brutal, unrelenting death scene in the history of horror. And that's, of course, the wooden splinter to the eye. That's the wife of Dr. Maynard, who the zombie breaks through the door and grabs her by the hair, by her scalp, and pushes her face towards this huge wooden splinter from the door. And it just keeps getting closer and closer and closer, and it's so sharp. And it goes right towards her eyeball, and the camera never turns away once, and it just goes all the way in, and you see it go right through her eyeball and just keep going. It's so brutal. You're like, ah! I remember when I first saw it, I just couldn't believe it. I'm like, oh my god, you know? Oh my god. Why isn't this censored at all? It's just never. And that's Lucio Fulci for you. He does not skimp on the gore. He does not skimp on the blood. He brings it full-blown 100% every time. That's why he's on the list twice here. Alright guys, so that's my top 10 horror movie death scenes. So guys, feel free if you want to do a response video, but if you do, give credit to Horror Enthusiasts 101. And thank you for joining me, Sean Patrick Urshan, in the Horror Corner. Tune in and stay scared.